promised, this episode is about information on the Crusaders. And this information can be found in a recent translation of a manuscript that was written 1,000 years ago by a contemporary of the Crusaders. And we have a special guest today. She's a world-renowned expert on the Crusades, and she's going to help us to make sense of the parts in the manuscript where the author talks specifically about the Crusaders. Welcome back to Bold Books and Bones. You might remember from a previous Bold Books and Bones episode that this manuscript is called the Chronicle of Michael the Great, and it contains a history of the world written by an Orthodox patriarch who lived about 1,000 years ago. If you would like to see the episode, you find the link up here somewhere. Now, while I was reading the English translation of this old text, I came across the sections where the author, Michael the Great or Michael the Syrian, wrote about the Crusaders. He calls them the Franks, referring to the area that we call France today, because this is where they initially came from. Now, why did he write about them? That is because the author lived in the greater Syrian area at the time of the First Crusade. Now, suddenly, knights with their armies show up out of nowhere. And they were Christians too, just like him. However, they belonged to a different branch, the Roman Church. Additionally, they came to wage war in his land against the Turks and the Arabs, but even the local Christians were not always spared. So, throughout his chronicle, Michael the Great wrote down what he learned and observed about the Crusaders. But what is so fascinating about this ancient text is that the story is now told from the opposite perspective. Now, since this text is very old, and I assume that not everyone who watches this episode is an expert on the Crusades, I'm definitely not an expert, and therefore I have something special for you and for me today. I have invited a very knowledgeable and kind guest. Her name is Carole Hillenbrand, and she has spent most of her professional life studying the Crusades from an Islamic perspective. She's British, works in Scotland at the University of Edinburgh and St. Andrews, speaks many languages including Arabic, Turkish, Persian, French and German, and she's highly respected, among many other things, for writing this 600 pages long and remarkable work about the Crusades. The book is called The Crusades Islamic Perspective. I can't wait to share with you what Carole Hillenbrand had to say. Here are some abstracts from our long and interesting talk. Hello, Carole.
Hello, Lieven.
Thank you for taking the time to be a guest at Bold Books and Bones. As you know, I read the English translation of the Syriac copy of the Chronicle of Michael the Great, and I'm wondering if you can help me out with some of the things that he writes about the Crusaders. I have a disclaimer already. I was never really a big fan of the Crusaders, and I know very little about them, so I hope that is not a problem for you.
Not at all, because I have been studying how the Muslims felt about them coming and attacking their territory and occupying their lands. So from that point of view, it was quite interesting for me to have a look again at Michael the Syrian. And of course, sometimes I agree with him and sometimes I don't.
Sometimes she agrees with him and sometimes she doesn't. That sounds perfect to me, because she is a lady who has well-founded opinions on the subject that are based upon research and facts. And that, of course, can only enrich our knowledge. Now, the first thing I wanted to ask her, because it had caught my attention in the manuscript, is this mysterious story about the brass statues. So let's see what Michael the Great wrote about it. At the time when the Franks besieged Constantinople, Antioch collapsed in an earthquake. In the middle of the foundation of one of the towers that collapsed, a large house was exposed in the ground, in which there were huge statues of brass in the likeness of Franks mounting horses, fully dressed and carrying weapons, spears and swords and the rest. All of them were of brass, harnessed and bound with iron. The governor, Agusin the Turk, ordered an inquiry about them, and because no one knew anything about them and no book that shed light, he thought that they were cultic idols for pagans. Therefore, he ordered them destroyed. Thereafter, a blind old woman was found who said, "I heard the ancients saying that there are under such and such tower talismans concerning the nation of the Franks, that they will not march out and will not cross the sea." When the governor heard these things from the mouth of the old woman, he regretted that he shattered them. He said to her, "Did you hear about how they were made? Is it still possible to make them?" When she answered, "No," they hit her and killed her. So Carole, help me out here, because this is a story that would be a perfect opening of a novel about the Crusaders, I would say. But what do we really know about this story? Because in your book, Syria in Crusaders' Times, I also came across this story in the chapter by Paul Kopp called History of the Franks Revisited. And from his research, I understand that there were several occasions in which such brass figures were found. So help us out here. What do we really know about this very mysterious story?
It's very mysterious, very interesting. The references in medieval Arabic and Syriac sources to brass figurines of armed horsemen found under the walls of Antioch and under a nearby monastery can be explained as a perennial custom that can be traced back some 4,000 years. In the case of the armed horsemen in Antioch, their clear purpose is to provide protection for the buildings constructed above them. If you like, you can call it a form of sympathetic magic that operates in the spiritual realm. However, one should be alert to the possibility that the specific interpretation of these horsemen as Franks or even Turks is an ex post facto interpretation applied to them after people had already encountered real Turks and Franks. In other words, it's a practice which has been going on for many hundreds and thousands of years, with a lot of significance, shall we say, for people who find these objects. They were intended to find them by the people who put them there.
Mm-hmm. So people after the facts said these statues were protecting us from the Franks, and probably because the Franks were there, they make that link between these two then.
Yes.
Okay.
Antioch was a very key moment in the beginning of the First Crusade. It was a real key moment because if the Turks had won, the First Crusade wouldn't have got any further.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you very much. I still love this brass statue story, because I think if one wants to make a very nice movie about the Crusaders, that would be a lovely start of the story, I think.
Absolutely.
At another place in the manuscript, we read how Michael the Great tells the story of the arrival of the Crusaders. He writes about the 2 kings and 7 commanders that arrive in Antioch. And then he even gives the list of the 9 names. Now, what I did not understand was the difference between the Crusaders and the Templars, who he calls the brothers. And of course, I asked Carole about it.
The Templars were certainly Crusaders, but all Crusaders were not Templars. The Templars were established as a special group in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem around the year 1119. They were named after the Temple of Solomon, which had been replaced on top of the Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site for Muslims everywhere, which was situated on the lower esplanade of the noble sanctuary in Jerusalem. It was there, in the Temple of Solomon, that the Templars took up residence in the 1120s. The idea of an order, with a capital O, which would be both religious and military, probably came from a knight from Champagne called Hugh of Payon. He, Hugh, had persuaded King Baldwin I to allow him and some companions to move to the Aqsa Mosque as their headquarters. As a small chivalric order of knights, they began by protecting pilgrims coming from the Mediterranean coast to Jerusalem. But as time went on, the Templars provided a regular army of trained soldiers for the ruler of Jerusalem. King Baldwin I supported them fully, but their allegiance was only to the Pope, who recognized them in 1127. Their prestige spread through Europe, and they were sure of a regular supply of fighting men. Later on, they looked after existing fortresses and also built new castles. They became a body of elite warriors who were the main support of rulers in warfare. They were greatly feared and hated by their Muslim enemies. But as Michael the Syrian writes, I quote, "The Templars were friendly and charitable for all those who adored the cross."
Okay, all right, thank you very much. It's interesting to hear this difference because there are so many legends about the Crusaders and the Templars, but they were not the same.
Yes.
Okay. There is at another place of the manuscript, we read after the Franks attacked Antioch and went into the city. The city was besieged by the Turks, and because of that, Michael the Great writes the following. The Franks were so much under the pressure of hunger that they ate their own horses. They sought refuge in prayer, and at that point it was revealed to King Tancred in a dream, opening a place in the church of Cassianus. They found there the nails of the cross of our Lord. Now my question to you is that there are several occasions where the Crusaders found holy relics. Here it are the nails of the cross, but there is also a spear that was found. Was that part of their mission to seek these relics, or what can you tell us about it? How do we need to understand this?
Well, I think both issues are true. They found them by accident. But thereafter, they became so famous that other people came to see them. There are many objects allegedly associated with Jesus, and especially connected with his crucifixion. They were found sometimes in churches and other religious sites. While some Christians believed, and indeed still do believe, in the authenticity of Jesus relics, others doubted their validity. Now let's take the example of the holy nails. At least 30 holy nails of Jesus were venerated as relics across Europe, even as late as the early 20th century. So it's a matter of, for those who did believe in their authenticity, the spiritual experience must have been unforgettable. And we could name a number of other relics of this kind. But 30 holy nails, it's quite a significant one.
I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this in-depth look of what Michael the Great had to say about the Crusaders. In the next part, we will continue to read this manuscript and we will pay particular attention to a part of this ancient text where Michael the Great gives a long and detailed account on the Crusaders. He talks about their habits, initiation rules, and the way they lived together with the local population. In the meanwhile, please stay free and healthy, and see you at the next episode of Bold Books and Bones. Bye.